So on Friday, I made a video talking about every team's best contract currently, and I thought it would be an interesting exercise to do the opposite of that. Let's talk about every team's current worst contract that they have right now. And a lot of people ask me, where do I get this NBA score thing? It's just Tibbet, Tidbyt. You can get one online. I think it's pretty cool for a desk setup. Just a quick clarification before we get into this. Every player that I'm going to talk about here is not necessarily a bad player. A lot of these guys are good players in this league and are deserved a lot of money, but maybe they're just getting paid a little bit too much. Maybe they get injured a little bit more than you would have liked them to. And for some teams, it was really tough picking their worst contract. So we're going to start off with an easy one, in my opinion, with the Chicago Bulls. We're going to talk about Zach LaVine, a contract that was untradeable for Chicago this offseason. The Bulls tried trading Zach LaVine for necessarily nothing in return this offseason. They tried trading LaVine to Golden State for just Andrew Wiggins in return, just to get off of this LaVine contract long term, and Golden State wasn't having any of that. LaVine is owed $43 million in 2025. $46 million in 2026, and then has a player option of $48.9 million in 2027 when he's going to be 32 years old. LaVine isn't a bad player by any means. His last full year in this league, he was a productive player where he averaged 25 points, 4.5 rebounds, 4 assists a night, and shot 38% from 3 on 7 attempts a night. It's just over the years, there's still the defensive deficiencies. There's still the injury concerns, especially last year where he only appeared in 25 games. And it's come to a point in LaVine's career where we know he's a floor raiser as a player, but no longer a ceiling raiser. And if you're allocating over 30% of your team's cap space to Zach LaVine, it's very tough to win in the year 2024. I actually don't think the Indiana Pacers have a bad contract on their team right now. So for the sake of this exercise, I'm going to just talk about Obi Toppin, because in the 2024-25 season, Obi Toppin is getting paid the 4th highest amount on this Pacers team, $13.5 million a year. But then he's under contract for next year at $14.5 million, and then again in 2027 for $15 million, and then again in 2028 for $16.5 million. I like Obi Toppin a ton. He was really good last year. He shot 40% from 3 for Indiana. He's a nice spark plug off the bench, but you're going to be paying him mid-level exception money for the next 4 years. Is that going to stump the development of Jarris Walker? But it is an easy tradable contract in this league if Obi Toppin can continue to show that he's a plus 3-point shooter in this league. So I think it's going to be fine as a contract. Like I said, we're going to talk about much worse contracts. I just had to pick someone because he's making 10% of the Pacers cap space. For the Milwaukee Bucks, this is an easy one. We're going to talk about Pat Connaughton. And I feel like the Bucks have tried to trade Pat Connaughton for the last couple of years now. He's owed $9.4 million this year and $9.4 million next year because he has a player option that he's definitely going to pick up. This could be a nice tradable contract if he was worth anything on the open market. He made $9 million last year, so this is year 2 of that 3-year deal. He did shoot 36% from 3 last year. He did shoot 34% from 3 last year, which is fine, but he's not a good defender in this league, and it's really tough to play him meaningful minutes on a playoff team. And for a team like the Bucks that could definitely use somebody better off the bench, Pat Connaughton is making a little bit more than they probably would have liked. It's funny how a bad contract could be looked as a good scenario in some teams' current situation. So for the Detroit Pistons, I'm going to talk about Tobias Harris, who they signed this offseason. And Tobias Harris, for what he did last year, making $25 million this year and $26 million next year, is 100% an overpay. But Detroit needed to do that. They're not a big free agency destination. They're a team that was the worst team in the league last year, one of the worst teams of all time. They needed to add veterans around Cade Cunningham, and they did so with Tobias. But when you still objectively look at Tobias Harris, this dude is overpaid. He should not be making $26 million a year next year for what he did last year for Philadelphia, especially in the playoffs as well. In the lone playoff series against the Knicks, he averaged 9 points and shot 43% from the field. And he was making up like a third of Philadelphia's cap space last year, and still gets rewarded for it this offseason. But hey, I said that Detroit needed to add guys like this, and they did. They just had to overpay. I never really got this contract when it happened, and I'm not really a big fan of him overall, and that is Georges Niang of the Cleveland Cavaliers. I could have talked about Caris LeVert here, but he is in the final year of this deal, so it's not as bad anymore. But I don't really think Georges Niang is someone that you can rely on in a playoff series, and that's what Cleveland is looking to do going forward. Now, he has been a good 3-point shooter. Don't get me wrong. He did shoot 37% from 3 last year on 5 attempts a night. I just think he's such a bad player on the defensive end of the floor that at times he can become unplayable in the playoffs, and he was at times last year. He didn't play a lot against Orlando in round number 1, and he wasn't hitting his threes. He shot 13% from 3, and then in 8 minutes a night in round number 2 against Boston, he shot 12% from 3. And if you also look at past playoff series for Georges Niang in Utah and Philadelphia, it's not the greatest either. He's a good regular season 3-point shooter, and if your worst contract is making $8.5 million, that's not bad whatsoever. But maybe at one point we'll talk about Darius Garland or Jared Allen or Evan Mobley in a year or two. It's really tough for Portland because I wanted to talk about Jeremy Grant because he's getting paid a boatload of money, but we see he's actually equaling the production out there, even though he might be a little bit overpaid for the duration of that contract. I could also talk about Robert Williams, who's on not too bad of a contract for what what we've seen from him in his career so far with Boston, but he's just never healthy. I'm just going to briefly talk about Matisse Thybulle, though, who's owed $11.5 million this year and has an $11.5 million player option next year. And over the last 2.5 years, Matisse Thybulle has turned into one of the worst offensive players in the league. Now, last year, he wasn't terrible from three for Portland. He does shoot around 35% from three on 3 attempts a night, and he's still an above average defender, but he is nothing outside of that. This dude cannot drive to the rim. He can't finish inside. He's not aggressive whatsoever. And $11.5 million for a good defensive player in 2024 isn't the worst thing in the world. It was really tough for me for Portland to decide between Jeremy Grant's massive contract or Robert Williams, who doesn't really play, or Matisse Thybulle. Or you could even talk about DeAndre Ayton, who's making up 24% of their cap space, making $34 million a year, but at least he's still 26 and putting up good production on the floor and doesn't get hurt as often as Robert Williams does. For the Utah Jazz, I'm going to talk about John Collins, who's making $26.5 million this year and then has a $26.5 million player option next year. Now, it was between John Collins and Jordan Clarkson. Jordan Clarkson is making $14 million this year, $14 million next year. The only thing that you could maybe choose Jordan Clarkson is he's guaranteed that $14 million next year. Maybe there's a way that John Collins plays really good this year and he can get a long multi-year deal this offseason and get more money guaranteed and opts out of that $26.5 million player option next year, because if he doesn't, that is a lot of money for someone that's going to be 28 years old. Is he going to be making up 17% of their cap space? And I actually think he's a good player in this league, and he could be someone that could be a nice floor spacing big man at the 5 spot, but I do think he's taking minutes away from Taylor Hendricks and Walker Kessler, and that's not really what you want in this Utah Jazz rebuild. For Denver, it's going to be someone that's going to be kicking in his first year of that rookie extended extension, and that is Zeke Nnaji. Zeke Nnaji is going to be making $8.8 million this year, $8 million next year, $7.5 million in 2027, and has a $7.5 million player option in 2028, and he was a big disappointment for Denver last year. Now, to look on the bright side, that was the last year of his rookie contract, so that is not any production on this new contract extension yet. That is going to start this year, so they need Zeke Nnaji to bounce back, because last year, 3 points, 2 rebounds, struggled to stay on the floor, just around 9 minutes a night, looked lost defensively. He had some floor spacing potential in his early days in his career, and that went away last year, just shooting 26% from 3. So Denver needs him to bounce back as a rotational big man for them this year, especially with De'Ron Holmes, their first round pick, being out for the year. All right, I am stumped. For Minnesota, I couldn't really decide on their worst contract. Rudy Gobert is making $43 million this year, $46.5 million on a player option next year, but he did just win Defensive Player of the Year last year, so maybe as your highest paid player, that isn't the greatest, so you could talk about him. Julius Randle is making $33 million, but could be a free agent next year. Naz Reid, Dante DiVincenzo, Mike Conley are not overpaid whatsoever, so the only thing I can think of is the duration of the Jaden McDaniels contract. If he doesn't take a step offensively, maybe paying him $30 million a year in 5 years from now is going to hurt you, but I'm high on Jaden McDaniels. He's an elite perimeter defender. I think he's going to be fine offensively. So for Minnesota, I'm stumped, and you T-Wolves fans can let me know what you think in the comments. For OKC, it's tough as well, so I'm just going to talk about Kenrich Williams, who's making $6.7 million this year, $7 million next year, but might not be in the rotation at all whatsoever in the playoffs. Because OKC has a ton of good contracts. They still have high talented players on their rookie deals, and I think Kenrich Williams is a great hustle guy. I think he's someone that is a nice rotational piece. Last year, he appeared in 69 games, 15 minutes a night, and shot 39% from 3. I'm just saying, if you're paying him $7 million next year and he's not in your rotation, maybe that's going to be defined as your worst contract. And like I said about for the Pacers before, there's going to be a ton of worst contracts that we're going to mention. For the New York Knicks, it could be 2 guys. You could mention Karl-Anthony Towns because of how massive that contract gets, but I think it's going to be fine. I think it's going to age well. So I'm going to talk about OG Anunoby, who re-signed with the Knicks this offseason. And OG is due $36 million this year, $39 million next year, $42.5 million in 2027, $45 million in 2028, and has a $48 million player option in 2029, and OG Anunoby is going to be 32 years old then. And I mentioned in the beginning of the video, I'm going to talk about good players that just could be getting overpaid a little bit, and by definition, OG Anunoby is not a top 20 player in this league. He's not a top 30 player in this league, but he's getting paid that money. So yes, he is overpaid, and he had all the leverage in a negotiation with the Knicks this offseason, given what they gave up for him last year by sending RJ Barrett and Emmanuel Quickley to Toronto. But the thing with OG is, he has yet to play above 70 games since his rookie season. He got hurt for the Knicks in the playoffs last year. He got hurt immediately after they got him. He was hurt in January with the elbow injury. So the big thing with OG is, can he stay healthy on the floor? Because if not, this contract could be a disaster in 3 to 4 years. I know he only has 1 year left on the deal, but the fact that he's making $40 million, I still want to talk about him, and that is Ben Simmons of the Brooklyn Nets. It's crazy how little Ben Simmons has played over the last 3 years. He held out with the back and the disgruntlement in Philadelphia in the 2022 season, did not play a single game, even after getting traded to Brooklyn. Then in 2023, appeared in just 42 games, and then last year for Brooklyn, appeared in just 15 games. I know we see the workout videos every offseason. I know we say that maybe Ben Simmons could make somewhat of a comeback. I can't believe it until I see it. And until then, Ben Simmons is still going to be one of the worst contracts in the league until this contract is done at the end of the year. Because $40 million for someone that has played under 60 games in the last 3 years is insane. For Boston, it's really tough as well because they just won a title with basically everybody under contract. Now, they re-signed everybody. Tatum's got a supermax kicking in. Jaylen Brown supermax kicks in this year. I think I'm going to say what I said for Minnesota. I don't really think they have a bad contract right now. The only thing you could mention is Drew Holiday, who's 34 years old. He's making $30 million this year, $32 million next year, $34.5 million in 2027, and he has a $37 million player option in 2028 when he's going to be 38 years old. Maybe that's a disaster then, but until we see the regression, this Celtics team is going to be competing for titles until further notice, so I think they're fine when it comes to having bad contracts on their cap sheet. For Philadelphia, this is also going to be someone that signed this offseason, so I talked about OG Anunoby for the Knicks. For Philadelphia, we're going to talk about Paul George. Now, Paul George is a great player. Don't get me wrong. He's someone that is an all-star year in and year out, but he's going to be going into year number 15. He just signed a massive 4-year deal with Philadelphia where he's going to be making $56.5 million, 30% of their cap space in 2028 when he's a 38-year-old. That's a little bit scary for someone that has also had some injury concerns over the last couple of years. He was healthy for the Clippers last year, but from 2020 to 2023, he missed a decent amount of time, and he's going to be 35 years old at the end of the year. I'm a little scared on how this contract is going to age, but Paul George in 2024 is still a good player. For Toronto, it's kind of tough as well. I actually don't mind the Emmanuel Quickley extension or Scotty Barnes, and I think RJ Barrett's a little bit underpaid compared to what his market value would be. I think Jakob Poeltl's contract is fine too in 2024. So I'm just going to talk about Bruce Brown quickly. Bruce Brown is just in the final year of that 2-year deal that he signed with the Indiana Pacers last year, $23 million, and Toronto picked up that team option to have the chance to trade him because he's still a good role player in this league. But for his production, it is tough to match that $23 million salary. It's tough to match that $23 million salary. And if they can't move Bruce Brown this year, it's going to be even worse of a contract since that was the main salary they got back in the Pascal Siakam trade. For the LA Lakers, I went back and forth between Gabe Vincent and Jared Vanderbilt. I ended up going with Jared Vanderbilt just because Jared Vanderbilt is under contract for 2 more years than Gabe Vincent. He's still just 25 years old, 3 years younger than Vincent, but he's making $10 million this year, $11 million next year, $12.4 million in 2027, and then has a $13 million player option in 2028. And I still think Vanderbilt's a good player. I liked him a ton coming out of Kentucky. I liked him at Minnesota and Utah in the league. And he was banged up last year for sure, but maybe if those injuries carry over into this year for LA, it's not going to be the greatest contract in the world. But if he bounces back to what he was before the injury, I think it's going to be just fine for LA, and we're no longer going to be talking this as a potential bad contract. For the LA Clippers, a part of me wanted to say Kawhi Leonard just because of the injury concerns. He's getting up there in age and he's making 33% of their cap space. But I'm going to talk about PJ Tucker, who's going to be making $11.5 million this year, 8% of the Clippers cap. It may not play a single game. Yeah, PJ Tucker's just collecting a check at this point. He signed with the 76ers back in 2022, but then was included in the James Harden trade to match the salary. He appeared in 28 games for the Clippers last year. He seems unhappy there, but he is no longer the elite 3D player that he used to be in Houston and Miami and Milwaukee. So paying $11 million for someone that's just not really going to play for you is a bad contract. For Phoenix, it's probably the worst contract in the NBA right now, and that is Bradley Beal. Bradley Beal signed that Supermax extension with the Washington Wizards in the summer of 2022, and Beal's Supermax has fully kicked in now. $50 million this year, $53 million next year, $57 million player option in 2027, and the kicker in Beal's contract that makes it by far the worst in the league in my opinion, he has a no trade clause as well. So Phoenix does not have an out in all this, and KD's their number 1 scorer. Devin Booker's their number 2. Bradley Beal's not an elite defender. He's not an elite playmaker, so it is really tough to justify paying super max money for your 3rd scoring option, who's not going to ever put up 25 plus points per game anymore because he's behind KD and D Book. For Golden State, I thought about putting Draymond Green because he struggles to stay on the floor at times, but that's because of suspensions and on the court stuff rather than injuries. But you have to talk about Andrew Wiggins right now, who's 29 years old, and he's making $26 million this year, $28 million next year, and is a $30 million player option option in 2027. And it's been all downhill for Wiggins since he had his best year of his career in 2022 for Golden State when they won the NBA Finals. He was fine last year in 37 games, but had off the court issues. Last year, though, he played 71 games, but was not a positive player on either end of the floor. 13 points. He shot 45% from the field, 35% from three, 4.5 rebounds a night, was not a good playmaker, and like I said, was not a good defender either. And he's going to be making 18% of their cap space in 3 years when he's 32 years old. And I don't think his skill set is going to age particularly well right now. For Sacramento, they got off of one of the worst contracts in the league in Harrison Barnes this offseason for DeMar DeRozan. Job well done to them. So their current bad contract right now is Kevin Huerter, who's making $16.8 million this year, and then it goes up to $18 million next year. And there used to be a debate between Kevin Huerter and Malik Monk on who was the better shooting guard that this team should rock with going forward in closing minutes. Sacramento gave up a first-round pick to acquire him in the 2022 offseason, and he was phenomenal for them in 2023, but he took a step back last year. He wasn't hitting his threes as consistently. He wasn't a good defensive player, and it was just too much inconsistencies in big moments for Huerter as a shooter for Sacramento in his specialized role. So maybe he bounces back, shows what he did in 2023 this year in 2025, but until then, he's their current worst contract. So for Charlotte, you could look at this in two different ways. I think their worst contract in player value-wise is probably Grant Williams, who's making $13 million this year, $13.5 million next year, and $14 million in 2027. But you can also mention Miles Bridges, who's the same age as Grant Williams, and he got rewarded with a nice 3-year, $75 million contract extension this offseason, with obvious reasons why you wouldn't want to give a guy like him that much money in the offseason. So depending on the way you look at it, it could be Grant Williams or it could be Miles Bridges. Or this team is also paying $5 million for Davis Bertans to not be on the team. That's pretty bad as well. For Washington, they still have one of the worst contracts in the NBA. He was the salary that they got back in the Bradley Beal trade that they had to take on, and that is Jordan Poole, who's making $29 million this year, $31 million next year, and $34 million in 2027. He's still under contract for 3 more years. And Jordan Poole was definitely disappointing in his first year in Washington. People thought he could be a very efficient, maybe 20-point per game scorer, but last year it definitely wasn't that at all. He really struggled to be a top scoring option for them, wildly inefficient, horrible turnovers, and did not play winning basketball, but he did finish the season on a strong note. He was very good in March. He was good in a smaller sample size in April, and maybe if he can carry that momentum into the 2025 season, it's still going to be the team's worst contract because he's making up 20% of their team's total cap space, but it'll just feel a little bit better if he can go back to what he was in 2022 with Golden State. For Miami, I struggled with this one. Heat fans, you can let me know in the comments. So I thought about Tyler Hero, who's making $29 million this year, $31 million next year, and $33 million in 2027. And it seems like as every year goes on in that contract, it becomes more untradeable. But I still have a lot of stock in Tyler Hero. I think he's a good third option for this Heat team. So I'm just going to mention Duncan Robinson, who's owed $19.5 million this year and just owed $9.8 million next year, but it's a $19.8 million option. So if the Heat decide to not bring him back, they're going to have to eat $10 million in dead money, which I think makes this a little bit worse because at the end of the day, Tyler Hero is a much better player than Duncan Robinson. But at the end of the day, you just have to find the value on that. Do you think Tyler Hero is $20 million better than Duncan Robinson? Heat fans, I would love to know who you think is your worst contract in the comments. For Orlando, they're another team that I think doesn't really have a bad contract currently. Now, they re-signed a ton of guys and signed KCP last offseason. So one of those deals could definitely turn into the worst one. Maybe it's Goga Badatse or Mo Wagner or Gary Harris or somebody like that, or Jonathan Isaac if he can't show that he can stay healthy. So for Orlando, I didn't really have somebody right now. Maybe you could talk about KCP. If he doesn't age the best in a couple years, $20 million when he's 34 could get a little bit ugly, but I think Orlando is fine with their cap sheet right now, and a ton of these contracts are good value. For the Atlanta Hawks, since Clint Capella is in the final year of his deal, even though it's pissed me off that he's always blocked Onyeka Okongwu from starting, I'm not going to talk about him because it is an expiring contract, so I'll mention DeAndre Hunter, who's still on a pretty notable big deal. He's making $21.5 million this year, $23 million next year, and $25 million, 14.5% of the team's cap space in 2027. And Hunter is a solid player, but just making that much money when he's about to be 30 years old. And he's going to be getting paid like he's a number 2 or number 3 option on this team, when by then it's probably not going to be number 2 or 3 option. That's going to be Jalen Johnson and maybe Zachary Reese-Shea. It's going to be a little bit of an overpay by the next 3 years. For San Antonio, you could talk about Zach Collins. Maybe that Keldon Johnson contract doesn't age the best, but it's definitely Harrison Barnes. At least Collins gives you some big man depth, which is definitely needed for San Antonio behind Wemby. Harrison Barnes is making a little bit more money as well. $18 million this year as a 32-year-old and $19 million next year as a 33-year-old. And he's coming off one of the worst years of his career, at least on the defensive end of the floor. He's still a plus 3-point shooter, but it's not like he specializes in catch and shoot or running floppy sets off the ball. And at the end of the year, I could expect him to either be bought out or maybe at the end of the Spurs rotation. And for $18 million this year, $19 million next year, it's not great. For New Orleans, you could talk about DeJounte Murray and his extension, but I'm going to talk about CJ McCollum, who's still making $30+ million this year and next year. And at this point in CJ's career, he's still a good player, don't get me wrong, but he's 33 years old. He's going to be 35 at the end of this deal, and I don't think he should start. And I think the amount of money he's making makes the coaching staff and front office believing that he should start over guys that are better than him in Trey Murphy and Herb Jones. Houston doesn't have terrible contracts either. They can get out of the Fred VanVleet contract at the end of the year. They can get out of the Jock Landale contract at the end of the year. So I'll talk about Dylan Brooks, who I think played to the value of his contract last year and was pretty solid for them. But this contract is $22 million this year, $21 million next year, and then $20 million in 2027, about 12% of the team's cap. And he got off to a hot start last year, but did struggle in the second half with his 3-point shot. And as guys like Cam Whitmore get better, maybe they re-sign Jalen Green and Jabari Smith takes a step, there's going to be less and less minutes for Dylan Brooks. And maybe that's how he becomes overpaid in the NBA. But for Houston, they have a good cap sheet right now. For Memphis, it's going to be someone with one of these smaller AAVs that we're going to talk about, and that is John Conchar, who's slated to make $6 million this year, next year, and the following year in 2027. And he's probably not going to be in the rotation, I think, by then whatsoever. Because when you talk about Memphis, you got Ja, Bane, Smart, Triple J, and Zach Edey in the starting five. Main guys off the bench, you do have Brandon Clark, Luke Kennard, Santi Aldama, maybe Jake Moravia, Gigi Jackson, Vince Williams, maybe rookie Jalen Wells, and Cam Spencer or Scottie Pippen Jr. I just don't think Conchar is going to be a rotational guy. And for $6 million a year, that's just kind of eating in dead money at that point. And lastly, for the Dallas Mavericks, we'll talk about Maxi Kleber, who's slated to make $11 million this year and $11 million next year. And Maxi Kleber has also struggled to stay healthy. He did play 74 games, the most amount he could in 2020, but then 50 games in 2021, 59 games in 2022, 37 games in 2023, and then 43 games in 2024. And he also struggled to be a productive player in the playoffs as well. He was fine against the Clippers in round number 1, but he shot 33% from the field in 11 minutes a night in round number 3 against Minnesota, and he was unplayable whatsoever on both ends of the floor against Boston in the finals. But Dallas does lack big man depth, so maybe he's going to be useful at this point, making $11 million a year this year and next year. And that's going to wrap it up for me. I hope you guys did enjoy. Let me know your team's worst contract in the comments below. Do you agree with what I said? Do you disagree? Let me know. Subscribe if you're not already, and make sure you use code SROS, SROS at Underdog Fantasy. Link to that is in the description. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.